I think we have to go a little faster because we're not going to finish. Anyway, what's coming now is really relatively simple. So the Supreme Nirmanakaya, as I said before, it's a special kind of Buddha, like a founding Buddha with certain signs, going through what are called the 12 enlightened deeds. So there's just certain deeds such as being born at a special place, like with a special circumstances, being born, finding the Dharma, first living this extreme life of great luxury, and then being exposed to birth, aging, sickness and death, and then going off to engage in aesthetic practices. So those are like, the Buddhas, they manifest in a way which is a great example to other people in general, right? First, going through having everything you want, going to the other extreme of having nothing and finding the middle way, for instance. Yes, and so the rest of it, everything that you basically know about the Buddha, that's said to be a really good example. And so to set forth the teaching as the whole world religion, as Buddha Shakyamuni did, well, that would be a Supreme Nirmanakaya. Okay? And such a Supreme Nirmanakaya only appears once the teachings are totally gone. And then the good qualities of a Buddha's speech, well, you can read it on your own, but it's basically saying that it calms you, it delights you, and this is also interesting when you hear about other people going to a teaching, when later on you talk about what you heard, it's oftentimes that people hear different things, right? They agree maybe on the sentences, but they hear it differently, and that seems to happen much more often in the presence of a Lama. And so a lot of your questions get answered. This is also a phenomenon that's quite interesting, that people talk about, for instance, they had a question that bothered them for a long time, and then in that teaching it gets answered. So the teacher didn't know, right, from like ordinary perception, the teacher didn't know that this was the question the person had, but it gets answered. So that's also a quality of the Buddha's speech, or of a Buddha's speech, in that it answering the questions that we have an issue with. Okay. All right. So you could read this on your own, basically. Then the good qualities of a Buddha's mind. Of course, most important are knowledge and compassion, method and wisdom. Okay. Wisdom. Here the word knowledge is used, but it's really wisdom and compassion. Then the good qualities of the enlightened activities. Okay, so Buddhas work unceasingly, tirelessly, and effortlessly. I mean, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, I've never heard anyone having that much energy. Oftentimes people say, well, anger is a good thing, it gives you the energy to go on, right? Like anger can give you a lot of energy. But if you're angry for a few hours, you're exhausted afterwards. Whereas, I mean, it may give you the spur of the moment, you may be able to get up and, save your family, etc. But if you think of the power that love and compassion give you, once the Dalai Lama has so much energy. It's amazing. I know from the people working there, one of my ex-classmates, he's working for the private office, and he says that His Holiness is working more than before. Although he cut down on his schedule, he's no longer teaching as much as before. But then all these people come to see him. Again and again, there are now YouTube videos where His Holiness talks with doctors and about, less specifically the philosophy, but more general. Because it's one of his missions to introduce many of the ideas of the Dharma in schools. So that's what he wants to give back to India in particular, to introduce this, make it part of the curriculum. So His Holiness is like tirelessly working, and his staff works in shifts because they can't keep up with His Holiness. Yeah, it's too much. They have shifts. Okay. So therefore it's tireless. It's amazing. There's just no exhaustion. So they know what's most beneficial and they act according to what is most beneficial. And whatever they do is benefited towards the welfare of others. And what's here, excuse me, another analogy that I really like is that The Buddhas are like the sun, which effortlessly shines on all sentient beings. We just have to make an effort to step out of the shadow, right? So it's up to us. They're always ready to benefit us, but we are the ones who are hiding in the caves. Like, we're basically within samsara out of our own volition. Volition in the sense it's grasping, it's attachment to samsara. The doors are wide open. We're in this prison, right? The sun only in a limited way shines on us, and the doors are open. We're not taking the step outside, but the Buddhas shine on us all equally. But of course the Buddha is obstructed by one thing, or prevented from benefiting by one thing, which is our karma, right? So we have, as human beings, the karma to perceive beautiful smells, for instance, so the Buddhas can manifest that smell to inspire us, etc. But the point is more that we as humans are relatively free from certain worse kind of situations. We can receive the teachings, but we need to have the wish to do so, right? And basically expose ourselves to the teachings. And so the Buddha could not go against our karma. No way. Our karma is more powerful than the Buddha. Then the good qualities of the Dharma. Well, the Dharma is basically, you can't really separate it. The Dharma that is in the continuum of a Buddha. I think that's also really beautiful, that the Buddha lives the Dharma, the cessations and the truth of the path. The qualities are all in the continuum of a Buddha. So when we go back to taking refuge in the Dharma, well, you take mainly refuge in the qualities of the Buddha. You take refuge in those qualities, which the person itself is merely what we label based on those qualities, right? And so that will also account for the fact that you take refuge in those qualities, in their abilities, right? Those are said to be the actual Dharma. And we come to this when we get to the refuge of a hero, of a solitary realizer, of a bodhisattva. There are some differences, and that'll be explained further down. So here are the good qualities, of course, Dharma of scripture, so the scriptural Dharma and the Dharma of realizations. That's, again, when we say in the wider sense, we talk about the scriptural Dharma, the Dharma of scripture, which refers to the teachings, right? The scripture doesn't necessarily mean the book. It actually literally means, in Tibetan, it really means the teachings themselves, the oral teachings. They are said to be the scriptural teachings. In Tibetan, it actually says lung. Lung kind of means also an oral transmission. So scripture, that's just the English translation, but literally, and I've used it because that's what it's usually, that's usually used, but it doesn't mean the books, it means the teachings themselves. Okay. Versus the realizations that are attained as a result of that. And that again takes us to the Dharma in the stricter sense. So that categorization is very important. The scriptural teachings and the realizational teachings, or the Dharma of the scripture and the Dharma of realization, with one being the cause of the other, which actually one can be both ways. The realizations of the Buddha are the Dharma of realization. They set forth the Dharma of the teachings, or the scriptural Dharma, the Dharma of scripture, and that in turn leads to the Dharma of realization in our continuum. And then again, we, as a result of that, we teach others. So it's like a chicken and egg situation. What comes first? Right? Is it first the realizations that lead to the teachings, or is it first the teachings that lead to the realizations? So with regard to one person's continuum, which one comes first? With regard to the continuum of one person, does the Dharma of the scripture come first, or the Dharma of realization first? Pardon? No. If you take one person, let's say one person, just one person, what comes first in his or her continuum? The Dharma of realization or the Dharma of scripture? First the Dharma of realization, because the scripture comes from someone else. You receive the teachings from someone else, right? So what is the Dharma of scripture that comes from you? It's what you teach. And you can only teach if you have realizations first. So you have the Dharma of realization first, that then gives rise to your teachings. And this is where you also recognize a good teacher, or like a teacher whose realizations. To me, it's always Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche, such a good example. Have you heard of Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche? One of my teachers, Geshe Kelsang, both of them, they use examples that no one else does. Very different kind of examples, but totally conveying the Dharma. So that shows that they live the Dharma. They see the Dharma everywhere. And they see the Dharma in mannequins, and they see the Dharma in buses, and they see the Dharma. And so they get these examples, because it's their own experience. They teach what they've understood, and they teach it through. And of course, there are many great teachers, and we wouldn't say they have high realizations necessarily, but they still understand the Dharma. But I find it very obvious, or very strongly, I find it with Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche, who comes up with these. I've never been present. I've been present once when he gave a teaching. That was like an audience with a group of students. And he said something I never forget. But it was very funny, because when I went there, I was very arrogant. I thought, the movie Lama. All he does is make movies. What's so great about him, right? I had this arrogance. And there were these students from Emory University. They wanted to see him, and I was with them at that time, and so we all got an audience. I thought, great. Anyway, so I remember we sat there. He was kind of like more to the side. I looked at him from this side. We all sat in a circle. And then he said something like, the Buddha diluted the Dharma. And I was like, yeah, this movie Lama. Nobody's saying about the Buddha, right? Like, he diluted the Dharma, right? I was like, ugh. And then he said, the Buddha diluted the teachings in that he conveyed something that actually cannot be conveyed. And he said, it's like when you have a laser beam, you cannot see the laser beam, but you can paint color on it. In that way, you know at least roughly where it's located and what its shape is, or in which shape it manifests. So the Buddha's teachings are like spray painting a laser beam. I was like, whoa. That's when I changed. I thought, oh my God, he's amazing. That is so on the spot. What a good example. I changed 180% just from saying that. And I never forgot that. It was such a brilliant example. With the Buddha, basically, yes, what the Buddha conveys, he cannot really put it into words. That's why you have a unique way of teaching at the time of the Buddha, because that's how people talked, and he conveyed the truth according to what people could take. If he came in the 21st century, he would probably teach very differently. Use more examples of, I don't know, everyday life, biology, chemistry, etc. So the traditional teachings, we always try to go back, but we also need to try and change it. So that's what our teachers help us to do, like Dzongsa Khyentse Rinpoche. But the point is that what they teach us is as close as you can get using words, which of course is actually beyond words. So it's like spraying paint on a laser beam.
This actually explains what we asked before, what comes first in the refuge. Because like what you said now, the Buddha and the Sangha, they actually make the Dharma possible for people.
Yes, that's true. Of course, yes, it was without them. They need to know what's most appropriate. Yeah, that's a nice way of answering your own question. Why the Buddha comes first? But yeah, so it's a nice way of looking at it, that they are the ones who translate it. Find means and methods, because of their qualities, of course, which are Dharma, they're able to convey it to us in a way that we can get it. Although, of course, it's inexpressible what they're actually trying to tell us. Okay. All right. The good qualities of the Dharma, therefore, well, they are the scriptures and the realizations themselves, and we need to listen and contemplate on them and meditate on them to really get the results. And the Buddhas are born from the Dharma, and so therefore the results. So what comes first? Dharma, or actually the Dharma comes first, and the Buddhas are the results of that. Anyway, so you see, like, just checking what is the relation between what comes first. There's a lot of details we can go into, but we don't need to. Well, I want to get to the other text, which starts soon. The good qualities of the Sangha. Well, they teach the Dharma, they practice the Dharma, they reflect upon the Dharma, but of course they're not Buddhas. And one thing I'd like to say, I'd said that in the last course, but I think it's also really important for the way we relate to the Sangha, which here I'm talking about the Sangha in the wider sense. Even if we were to rely on the Arya Sangha, it doesn't mean that they're always sweet and they do whatever we want and they manifest in a way in which it doesn't bother our ego, etc. So we should keep that in mind. This is true for the Buddhas. I mean, it's really, when people think this homeless is just this loving, hugging bear or something. I mean, like, you know, in the sense of like just being this loving and wonderful, sweet person. And he is, but I've seen him wrathful. Wow, and that's scary. That is scary. I'll tell you something that happened once. A few years ago, we were in a teaching, and his homeless was teaching the Lamrim Chemo. That was when his homeless was still giving 2 weeks of teachings. And suddenly he stopped, and he said, "You, get up and go." Everyone was like, "What? Is he talking to me?" And so there was a monk. He told him to get up, and he wouldn't get up. So the bodyguards pulled him up, more or less, and he was asked to leave. Wow, we were in shock. I've never seen his homeless that wrathful. We were all like, and he asked him to leave, and he had to leave. And later on it turned out, because if his homeless kicked someone out, you investigate what is going on with that person. So that person was investigated. He was a monk from Ganden Monastery. He had been kind of like not listening really, but that's not a problem because most people don't really listen. I mean, a lot of people don't listen. A lot of lay people just have their picnic while the teachings take place. So that was not the reason. But they checked and they passed on a message to the monastery to check. And they broke into his room because for a long time they had suspected him of theft, but they couldn't prove anything. So this was reason enough for them to break open his door, go into his room, and they found all these stolen things. People had been missing shoes and, I don't know, money and what have you. So he'd been stealing it from the other monks. And his homeless, because of that, he was right away, he could no longer stay in the monastery. In fact, he was no longer a monk. If you steal from other people, and your theft is against the law of the country. And yes, of course, if you steal from other people money, definitely that's against the law of the... If you take someone else's pencil, it's not like you're going to go to prison. But stealing money, and what he had stolen, tape recorders, and at that time it was tape recorders. So he was right away removed from the monastery, and it was good for him. It was good for him. I mean, it was very embarrassing, and he was kicked out of the monastery, but he would have continued on without being punished to steal from other monks. He was not a monk any longer. He still pretended to be one who got the full benefits of being a monk. He was fed, he was clothed. It was not good for him to live like that. His holiness, it was like what they call a blessing in disguise. His holiness did him a great favor, but that was the only way, in that situation, the most effective way, just get him out. He was harming himself, he was harming the Buddha Dharma, and other monks through stealing from them. So that was the only way, only time. I've seen his holiness kind of like go, where's the offering, where's this, you know, like with the people around him, to make sure that they're mindful, and he can be quite strict, but never kicking anyone out. That was the only time. But there was a reason for that, right? Anyway, so it doesn't mean it can be very forceful, it can be really tough. And what I said last time was also when we look for the Dharma and we go into Buddhist centers or monasteries, don't expect to find some kind of paradise where everything is smooth and people are always nice to you and they would never give you a hard time. Well, that's not supposed to be Dharma. It's like Jetsume Densen Pamo says, if you want to smoothen a piece of wood, you take sandpaper. You're not going to use cotton wool, right? Cotton wool takes a long time to smoothen that piece of wood. But she says you need to have sandpaper, right? So if it's tough, if it's rough, it seems to be good. Now when we go to the monasteries and we want everyone to be like floating on clouds, that's totally unrealistic, right? Some hardships, even if in the Dharma center, like people complain so often, and I'm included, of course, in the problems of the Dharma center. But actually those are good, those are opportunities to practice patience. And how could everything be perfect? And if the people there are also still practicing, well, they're working with their own egos. And sometimes if you do too much, right, you can stretch it too far. And then there's, as a result of that, there may be strong emotions, so that could happen. So there are many different reasons. Either they manifest those, right? I mean, if there's no trouble in the Dharma center, you need a Buddha who manifests it. Because otherwise, if there are no challenges, if there's no sandpaper to roughen up our ego is just going to be lulled into the wrong sense of everything is going well, and I'm so kind and compassionate, and I'm so patient, because no one is testing my patience. No one is, right? So again, it's said to be good to have problems, to have difficulties, but those are the problems and difficulties that become a means for you to train the mind. But the Sangha, of course, ideally constitutes serious practitioners, and even if they're not the Arya Sangha, well, at least they're giving their best, doing their best, and it's important to seek the Sangha. Alright, then the way to take refuge by knowing the distinction. So the distinguishing or defining characteristics of the Buddha is full enlightenment. The Dharma is that it arises from the Buddha jewel. But again, it's like, which one is it? Which one is it? Does the Buddha arise from the Dharma, or the Dharma arise from the Buddha? Chicken and egg. But it's quite simple to say, from the point of view of one person, what comes first? Buddhahood or Dharma? Buddhahood. Because the Buddha Dharma that the Buddha teaches, he can only teach once he's become enlightened. So the real Dharma, like, it needs to come from the experience of a Buddha. So first you become enlightened, and then you can teach. So every person can teach the Dharma according to their own insights, really, like, sincerely. That's why you need a real teacher, okay? So a Lama, for instance. So in our case, as I said, it's just discussing it, just like classmates. But in the case of a Lama, like a real Lama, they have the actual insights, and then they teach that according to their insights. So the Buddha Dharma, the actual teachings that purely coming from the Buddha, you need to be a Buddha fast to be able to teach them. But here it says that the Dharma jewel, previously it said that the Buddha arises from the Dharma, but that's a Dharma that the Buddha hasn't realized yet, and based on that, the Buddha becomes enlightened. Okay? And that's, of course, based on the fact that Buddha was already enlightened when he came to this world. He just manifested the unenlightened state. Well, we come to that. Okay, so it's the distinguishing characteristic. It comes from the Buddha. And so the distinguishing characteristic of the Dharma jewel is that it arises from the Buddha jewel. During the above explanation of the good qualities of the Dharma jewel was presented as the cause of the Buddhas. Here it's presented as a result of the Buddhas. So it's true, but it's just from the point of view of one person. The Dharma is the result of the Buddha. A Sangha presents a different perspective, because the Dharma of scripture, that for instance Buddha Shakyamuni taught after his enlightenment, as well as the subsequent Dharma of realization, Arya path and cessations generated in the continuum of Shravakas, Pratyeka Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, both arise in dependence on the Buddha. Okay? So this is again, in terms of what Vada asked, first you are enlightened, first you become a Buddha, then you teach the Dharma, and based on that you have Arya beings. Remember, you ask about the order, so this is where the answer is given, according to this Sangha. So when you talk about it from the point of view of one person, so Buddha himself, before he could teach the Buddha Dharma, he had to gain the realizations. Of course, dependent on another Buddha Dharma, the Buddha became enlightened. Okay, but just from the point of view of Buddha Shakyamuni as one person, so he gave rise, he became enlightened first, then he taught the Dharma, and thereafter he taught it, in dependence on what he taught, then the Arya beings, that is the Sangha, came into existence. That's why we put the Buddha first.
It's historically.
The historic Buddha, yes, but you could say that with any other Buddha, non-historically. Like, for instance, if you follow mainly of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, before he could teach the way he teaches nowadays, which affects us in such a profound way, the Buddha, His Holiness would have had certain realizations. So first if he was a Buddha, become a Buddha. Then he teaches his unique teachings, which are different from Buddha Shakyamuni. His Holiness teaches very different from Buddha Shakyamuni. Right? If you look at the sutras, well done, well done. His Holiness doesn't just say, well, of course, the Buddha said definitely more. But His Holiness teaches just in a different style. And then that gives rise to realizations, and his students continue. Right? The same idea. Okay. So that's one way of looking at it. Then the distinction of the three jewels based on the activity. So the distinctive activity of the Buddha is to teach according to certain predispositions, aptitudes, aspirations, interests, and so forth, like an extremely skillful physician. The distinctive characteristic of the Dharma is to eradicate afflictive and cognitive obscurations, obstructions. So it's like, therefore, it's seen as medicine to overcome all shortcomings. And the distinctive activity of the Sangha is to take delight in dedicated practice and to foster enthusiasm, to assist us. Then the distinction based on devotion. Okay, so this distinction I find is really important. So the defining characteristics initially are clear, then the distinction based on activity, that's clear. How do we devote ourselves to the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha? Well, because the three jewels possess different characteristics and have different functions, we should devote ourselves to them accordingly. So the Buddha is someone who is regarded as the one who is to be honored and served, as in like honored, to see him as an example, right? Someone we want to become like, and serve in the sense that we try to repay their kindness, basically. Okay, so serve doesn't necessarily mean serve food, etc., but basically repaying their kindness through practicing what they teach us. The proper way to devote ourselves to the Dharma is to regard it as that which is to be actualized, which is to be generated in our own continuum. And devoting ourselves to the Sangha means seeing them as the spiritual community we associate with and respect as invaluable, true spiritual friends. Okay. Then how do we practice? We should make offerings and be of service to the Buddha. Again, make offerings, as in like practice generosity. Since the most valuable offering of practice is, of course, we should implement the teachings regarding the Dharma. It's not just an object of worship, but needs to be internalized. And any teaching, that's important, should be taken as personal instruction. Any teaching should be taken as personal instruction. That's really difficult because we may have an attachment towards doing this practice. We don't want to do that. But there is, like anything, you can't just have one cause. It needs to be a combination of many different ones. So our teachers always stress that. Whenever you receive a teachings, that is the main teaching in that moment you focus on. That is your main focal practice. And you take it as a personal instruction. And even if you read a book, like a Dharma book, it's about something you may not find interesting, to overcome that and look with regard to what this text says in that moment, how can that be relevant to me? How is that